Welcome to Renford Rewatched. In this episode, I talk to Renford Rejects fan Carl about the episode All in the Mind from Series 1. Carl, tell me, what are your memories, first of all, of this episode? Do you remember anything about it?
I have no recollection of watching this episode first time round, if I'm honest. It is quite a forgettable episode within the grand scheme of things.
It definitely is, yeah. I remembered certain scenes or things, but there's a lot of stuff that was reused later on, so that's probably where my confusion lies. So, this is an episode that opens with Vinny's black and white cam, which we're used to at this point, and he's talking to each of the individual rejects. And you kind of get this mockumentary style, don't you?
Yeah, I quite liked how they kind of followed that through with all of Vinny's little segments. I did wonder about whether or not the showing order of the episodes got shuffled around from filming to broadcast, because this kind of almost struck me as a second episode, let's meet the characters sort of thing, before then going into sort of each one in detail. Whereas this is episode 5?
Yeah.
At which point you're kind of used to them all and you know who they all are. So from that perspective, it was a bit of a waste of time.
Yes, it did feel like that. Going to kind of shuffle around a few things because there are things in this episode where you have to kind of zero in on. But one thing that struck me, and I think this is unusual for this thing, is normally there's an A plot and a B plot. This one, there's just the A plot. And when it looks like there's going to be a B plot, it doesn't materialize.
No, the MI5's football team appears for like 5 seconds. Eddie is in it for a little bit, but he's not sort of, they could have slotted in something between Eddie and Priscilla, but they didn't.
Priscilla's not even in this at all. One thing I noticed about Eddie was that they're almost making fun of the fact that he consistently uses Elvis song titles in his dialogue, almost as though it's the show saying, don't worry, this isn't forever, we're putting a stop to it, we know it's a thing, and just kind of rounding that out. But it feels kind of sad because I don't know, it just doesn't feel developed enough. And like you say, this probably was like the second or third episode they worked on where they weren't quite sure where they were going with it. So really the main point of the story is that Robin is doing a psychology course. She's talking to Stuart about it. And Stuart at this point, before we go into that actually, a few deviations. Stuart is still talking like a 1950s football commentator, which is very odd.
Yeah, he still has that put on posh accent that disappears very quickly as the series goes on, and he kind of Matthew Leach settles into talking in his own voice rather than putting on that kind of that posh accent. I know that was kind of how he was characterized from the beginning, but yeah, I think Stuart gets to become a much better character as time goes on.
Yes, I think so. So, as you were saying before we started recording this, the Robin story is quite forward-thinking, isn't it? It's just that the execution isn't always on point.
At the time, it would have been considered very stereotypical. Mental health wasn't something that anyone really spoke about back in the 1990s, especially when it came to men's sports in particular. You've got them all kind of sat around going and acting like, what was it Eddie said, acting like hippies. So, people that kind of talked about their feelings with each other were kind of seen as very soft and not normal back in the day. And in this case, we've got a group of men that hide their personal issues behind some deep-rooted fantasies.
Yes, which they go through one by one. They don't really explore Ronnie's side of it because he's still very one note, but certainly Jason and Ben and Bruno especially, I think, to the audience, is a character that you know he's putting up a pretense, especially as every episode up until this moment, he breaks character for a second.
Yes, and he does that again in this one as well, doesn't he? For
Yes.
quite a considerable length of time, actually. Once he thinks he's off camera and Vinny's not filming him anymore.
Makes you wonder, actually, what perspective we're looking at this. Is this whole thing just like Vinny's film, or is this reality? That's kind of the thing that confused me at the beginning, was that we start off with this Vinny mockumentary thing, black and white color, and then it kind of just cuts to, normally you would have like an establishing shot of the cafe coming down and then into that scene with that da-da-da-da-da-da music. But in this instance, you just cut straight to Jason and you think, we're in reality now. This is odd.
Yeah, Vinny's very much the audience representative character, isn't he? And he normally is the one who sort of sets up or explains to the audience what is happening that week and what the plot is going to be, or the expectation of what it's going to be for the rest of that episode. Whereas this time round, we don't get that at all. He's looking at each of his friends individually, and like I say, then it just kind of it jumps very much over to Robin. It's not Robin's trying something. Will it work? Will it not work? As part of his commentary, it just kind of happens almost as a completely separate, almost like they had two separate ideas for an episode and didn't quite know how to put it together properly.
As though they had like a storytelling mechanism and they kind of gave up halfway through. We've already established in this podcast that Robin at times is like a mentor to the other characters. Certainly in the previous one, she's a mentor to the other characters. And so here they almost trust her while also being rather scathing or unsure about what her methods are.
I mean, I suppose there is a tendency for female characters to appear a lot more emotionally mature in modern TV shows, most definitely. I haven't watched any other dramas from the 1990s for a very long time, so I couldn't tell you if that was the case on Grange Hill or Biker Grove or Press Gang or something like that. But in this case, we see immediately that from the first episode, not only is Robin a lot more skilled at football than the others, she's not living in that fantasy world like someone like Jason, pretending to be or thinking that she's better than she is. I mean, that obviously pays off for her later on in the series when she goes to play for is it the Chelsea women's team, I think?
Yes.
Or the Chelsea girls. So in that respect, that we kind of see that growth from that character as she goes on. Yeah, certainly in this episode, we immediately see that Robin is, or comes across as, a lot more mature than the boys do.
Yeah, until the end, where they kind of do a 180 on it.
I think that may have been a way of explaining why the boys are the way they are. It's been mentioned in podcasts and interviews that the characters all had a kind of a pre-written backstory that the audience had no clue about, that justifies the characters and the way they are. And it may be that was their way of sort of saying that actually these boys all live in this fantasy world because it's their way of coping with, I don't know, for example, maybe Ben's parents are going through some horrible divorce that we don't know about, and him sort of resorting to poetry is just his way of coping with that. Bruno is kind of that characteristic of the popularity of Italian football in the 1990s. Italia 90 being on like most mornings on Channel 4 at the weekends. I think we all knew a kid like Jason who had an overinflated ego when it came to playing football and thought he was a lot better than he actually was. So, I mean, for saying the show is written by an American writer and American creators, they get a lot of the stereotypes and cliches of sort of playground characters from schools of that time very, very close to reality. And it may be that, they may have those fantasies as a coping mechanism. And so Robin then sort of turns to a fantasy to cope with the fact that she got a D for her report and her project didn't actually work at all in the end.
And yet still had faith in it because she picked up on the energy of the others, even though they've done a 180 as well in their attitude. And I think, like you said earlier, and I've mentioned, the execution wouldn't be done the same these days, but the message is still there, and still quite a contemporary message that in the heat of the moment, it's okay just to take a deep breath and think.
I mean, we spoke a little bit before recording about it, and I think there's a lot of parallels with this episode with the way Ted Lasso ran. Both shows are about football, but kind of use it as more of a plot device than being just about football. There's not that many episodes of Renford Rejects that are exclusively about a football tournament or just a match. Normally there's something else going off, and it's the same with Ted Lasso. That was a show where the purpose of the coach wasn't to get the team to be a winning team. The purpose of the coach was to help those players become the best versions of themselves. And the show has broken down a lot of barriers with regards to discussions about mental health and other sensitive issues like sexuality within a sport that stereotypically and historically did not go anywhere near those sorts of issues. And it was interesting actually to see Stewart sort of brush off Robin's idea as not cricket, which is almost kind of, if she'd have suggested it to Basil Stoker, he'd have gone off on one and said, you can't, psychology, football's not about psychology. It's about, running down a field or some sort of Stokerism that he'd come out with. And it was interesting to see Stewart be a skeptic rather than the usual villains.
That somehow appeared sharper coming from Stewart because he was using that posh accent. And a lot of phrases. I mean, the amount of times he called them chaps was quite for somebody used to the later episodes would go back there and feel like, this is a little bit strange, perhaps, to see this early characterization. I think that other strange elements, because I was watching this thinking, I do not remember this at all. This is a very odd episode. And one of the reasons why this is the case is because of the strange references that are in this thing. Did you pick up, do you remember the name of the goalkeeper that Ben apparently idolizes?
His name, and I'm not sure if I didn't Google it, so I didn't know whether he was talking about someone that was real or not. My assumption was that was a real player, but yeah, I didn't look it up.
So his name was Lev Yashin, and he was a Russian goalkeeper. Got the stats in front of me for you football fans out there. He played for Dynamo Moscow between 1950 and 1970, making 326 appearances. And the stats I don't have in front of me, I think he saved somewhere in the region of 200 and... Well, yeah, something like... No, here we go. I've got it. 150 penalty kicks in his career. And is the only goalkeeper to have received the Ballon d'Or as well. So, yeah, it's like you said earlier about the American writers. The insertion of that reference kind of feels like then it would have been relatively obscure. Now you could probably just Google it, who was the best goalkeeper of all time, and that's who would come up. Then they must have had somebody pretty knowledgeable on staff.
Yeah, because you wouldn't have been able to Google that back in the 90s at all, would you?
No, definitely not. But it kind of fits into Ben's sensibilities somehow that it's that obscure.
Yes, exactly. He'd be the sort of person to come up with that sort of obscure reference. But I think it sort of shows how, despite all the sort of caricatures and things like that, at heart, all of those players in the Rejects are still into football, aren't they? They're not a bunch of people that don't like football that ended up just being together. They all support a football team. They're all into football. They may have overinflated ideas of how well they can play it, but they're all still very much interested in the game. And even though Ben is sort of comes off as an intellectual nerd, for want of a better word, I think that's more derogatory back then than it is now. But he was still into football and wanted to be a goalkeeper, to the point that he knew about this, I suppose, relatively obscure at the time, Russian goalkeeper.
And when you look up the stats and stuff, it makes perfect sense. The other reference that struck me was the Gene Hackman film.
Jason thought it was a woman as well that starred in the movie, because he refers to Gene Hackman as a she.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if he got the actors mixed up. I couldn't recall what film he he was talking about?
I'm going to assume, because I did a search on this, I'm going to assume that he's talking about, I mean, there's a couple out there. I've typed in Gene Hackman president movie, and a couple of them have come up. One from 1989 called The Package, and then one where he played a president, Gene Hackman, which came out a year before The Rejects, called Absolute Power. So I'm going to assume it's the latter, because that's a very current reference for that, you know, because in previous episodes, they've made references to Boyzone and stuff. So it's not always really obscure stuff.
No, it's not like a program at the time. Say, I used to watch a lot of Neighbours when I was a kid, and there was very, very few, if ever, references to the outside world on a soap opera like Neighbours. Whereas Renford Rejects is always aware of cultural touchstones of that era and previous as well. Props to whoever came up with the soundtrack for this episode as well. It was quite nice to see the Fun-Loving Criminals and Chumbawamba popping up.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I was just looking down my notes here and thinking that, you know, every time they use that piece of music for Ronnie, which I think is called Where Love Lives, and it's like a club mix by Alison Limerick, and it's just, it's sublime because it's so like of the period, of the moment, and fits kind of Ronnie talking about style. Like you say, Chumbawamba is in there. The Razors theme, Club to Death, I think, is in there for a few seconds. And that must be one of the few times that theme is heard, and yet there are no Razors on screen.
I was expecting Terry to pop up at some point, and I was like, where's Terry? They played his theme music.
Maybe by that point, they hadn't quite figured that out yet. I mean, did they do that in episode 2, Don Bruno? I feel like...
Yes, yeah, frequently. When Terry and James Corden were around, it was always playing in the background. So immediately it became their theme tune. They could easily have found the sort of 5-second spot for Terry Stoker to just kind of pop up and go, what are you lot doing? And then made fun of them and walked off. And that would have been perfectly in character and perfectly within the reality of the show.
Yes, I feel like, and we can do a bit of fan rewriting, if you will, but I feel like if they had rewritten this episode, the Stokers definitely would have been in it, and actually Stuart would have been a bit more for it normally.
Yes, definitely. He, rather than him being the foil, Stoker and Basil and Terry would have been the ones laughing at them for attempting some sort of mental health help within a man's game, as Basil Stoker would have said.
Yeah, but not necessarily established quite so much at that point. The thing that kind of strikes me, though, is that this feels like, to me anyway, a filler episode. Do you think this episode is the case for the seasons or series, as we called them, should have been shorter?
I don't think they should have been shorter. I think we got 12 episodes per season, which was a lot for any TV show back then, and would still be a lot now. Most sort of comedies that come out with half-an-hour episodes tend to be limited to 6 if they're made in the UK. So 12 worked quite well, and it meant that when it was broadcast on terrestrial television, it was on twice a week throughout the summer holidays.
Yeah.
Which worked quite nicely for me. In retrospective, it would have been quite good if they'd have had Robin analyse Terry and pull him apart and explain why is he the way he is, and then maybe Terry then ends up as a more relaxed person until Basil comes along and sort of sets him right. That would have been quite an interesting B plot to the show.
I think so, because it felt very fillery. Lots of scenes of people doing things that are really unrelated. More black and white shots of Bruno on his bike. Things like that. It's like you could have filled this with something else.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, some of the shots were great. It was still nice to see those really, really long takes they used to do in Gracelands, which I certainly didn't realise at the time, but that was something that wasn't done on most shows at all. It would normally be, you'd film someone, right, do it again, then move to the next cut. Whereas these guys have got to rehearse this entire take. It's almost like being in the theatre rather than watching it on television. One mistake, and they've got to set the entire thing up again, and then go back to the beginning. So for those young actors, many of them who hadn't been in anything before and haven't been in anything since, to pull that off was it speaks a lot of their talent.
It does, because that must have been really difficult to maintain that, especially at the beginning. I mean, they must have kept having to do like retake after retake. I mean, especially if somebody sneezes or coughs or anything like that. But props to them. You never really see any errors or mistakes.
No, not at all. I mean, I don't know who they ever got to play all the characters in the background. I will assume the guys who are sort of the MI5 team at the end were just the Razor extras with sunglasses on, who they just kind of got back in and reused them. The A-Team used to do that a lot back in the 1980s. You'd see the same actors pop up as like minor villains every 2 to 3 episodes. And I imagine to bring the costs down, that's probably what they did here, or roped in some kids from the local park or something to just kind of sit around and have a chat.
You can't imagine that they would have thought too much about the teams other than their names and maybe what they look like, or dressed like. But, nobody's sitting around thinking, wonder what this league actually looks like. Who are the teams in this league?
It reminds me of that episode of The Simpsons where Homer forms his own bowling league, and then they go up against all the stereotypical bowling teams, like the foreigners and the Christians and things like that. So it was interesting for sort of Robin and to comment on the fantasy of each of those players in the Rejects, but then you've got an entire team of players who dress like 1950s spies. What's their story?
Well, yeah, maybe they'll get to that at some point. There's probably some fan fiction somewhere of all the football teams and whatnot. Do you believe that this is perhaps the weakest episode of this first series?
My knowledge of, I haven't sat down and watched them all for a few years now, so I couldn't really comment on that, but probably would be my answer. As you say, nothing really happens throughout the entire thing, apart from them coming to terms with the fact that they lost.
Yeah, it just feels like somebody's like second draft idea of a story, and they're like, well, we'll just use it. Someone noted on one of the YouTube videos that they actually won the game in the previous episode. So to come to the next episode and say we've lost our last 4 matches, it does kind of play with the flexibility of the reality. Like, are we seeing things in chronological order? I
mean, it says, I'm sure Stuart says at the beginning that if we lose our next match, we're relegated. But then later on, it's just, we've just lost our game. They don't make any mention about them having been relegated from whatever league they happen to be in. It's always, it's the last match of the season against the Razors, and if they lose that, then they get relegated.
Yeah, and yet they always end up playing the Razors in the next year anyway.
Maybe something happens in the interim where they get promoted again.
You mean one of the Sunday League football teams goes into administration? I mean, it's very odd.
Maybe it resets every term. We see 12 weeks. That's kind of like almost 2 half terms of a school year, isn't it? Maybe maybe for the other 2 terms, they end up getting promoted again. Then by the next season, they're back in that particular division.
Maybe. I don't think they were thinking too much about continuity in this stuff. They weren't expecting a couple of people, 25 years later to look at it and go, well, what's with this continuity?
I mean, I always think to myself, what must the parents of all these children think? I mean, I suppose a character like Ben or Jason would be fairly straightforward, but does Bruno speak in his Italian accent at the dinner table when he's having tea with his parents in the evening?
That's an interesting thing. I think the boring Barry Grade episode almost gives you an idea because he does speak in the Italian accent at home in that episode. But whether he keeps it up the entire day, Maybe it's just when he wakes up in the morning, who knows? But based on
What
that
would his
episode,
teachers think at school?
I think they just go. I think you'd just go with it, wouldn't you?
Mm.
I think so. Anyway, yeah, that is all in the mind. Please do let me know what you think of this episode by tweeting me at Renford on Twitter. Is it your favorite episode of the series, or are you like us and think maybe it was a bit of filler? Thanks, Carl, for joining me.
No problem.